For 3,500 years, sand and silence buried a secret nobody was ever meant to uncover. Not tomb robbers, not treasure hunters, not even the priests who once tried to erase it from memory. A king's final resting place, hidden so well that generations of archaeologists walked past it without ever knowing it was there. And when a team finally broke through the debris and stepped inside, what they found wasn't gold or a jewel-covered mummy. It was something stranger. A tomb stripped almost bare, flooded, half-collapsed, and yet unmistakably royal. The kind of discovery that raises more questions than it answers. Because this wasn't just any burial. This was the last missing tomb of an entire dynasty. The one Egyptologists had quietly given up hope of ever finding. To understand why this discovery matters so much, you have to understand just how rare it actually is. Since 1922, when Howard Carter pulled back the seal on Tutankhamun's tomb and found it essentially untouched, no other pharaoh's burial place had been found in the Valley of the Kings, or its surrounding valleys. A handful of royal tombs turned up elsewhere in Egypt over the following century, in Tanis in the late 1930s, and in Abydos in 2014, but nothing tied to the Valley of the Kings itself. An entire century passed. Multiple generations of archaeologists spent their careers digging in the same stretch of desert without a single new royal tomb to show for it. So when word broke that a team had finally found one, it wasn't just news. It was the end of a 100-year drought. The tomb belonged to Thutmos II, the fourth pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty, and its discovery was announced in February 2025 by Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, working alongside a joint British-Egyptian mission. But here's the part that makes this story so compelling. The team didn't stumble onto this tomb overnight. They had actually found its entrance back in October 2022, more than 2 years before the public announcement. For over 2 years, archaeologists worked the site quietly, digging, mapping, and trying to figure out exactly what they'd found, because at first, they had absolutely no idea it belonged to a king at all. The location itself gave them the wrong impression from the very beginning. The tomb sits roughly 2.5 kilometers west of the Valley of the Kings, in an area known as Wadi Gabanat el-Kurud, sometimes called the Wadi of the Monkeys. It's tucked beneath a natural waterfall in the Theban mountains, in a spot far closer to the Valley of the Queens than to the burial ground of the kings, because it sat so close to tombs belonging to the wives of Thutmos III, not far from the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. The excavation team assumed early on that they were looking at the tomb of a royal wife, not a pharaoh. It was catalogued simply as Tomb C4, a placeholder name for what they thought was a secondary, less significant burial. That assumption made sense on paper. Wadi Gabanat el-Kurud had never been treated as a burial ground for kings. It sits in a rugged, difficult-to-access stretch of the Theban mountains, cut off from the main Valley of the Kings by a wall of cliffs, and the handful of tombs previously known in the area belonged almost exclusively to royal women. So when the first signs of a tomb entrance appeared there in 2022, nobody on the team was expecting to be looking at a king. Early Egyptology has a long history of misidentifying tombs based on location alone, and for a while, this looked like it might follow that same pattern. But the deeper the team dug, the less that explanation made sense. The entrance gave way to a wide staircase and an unusually large descending corridor, architectural features far grander than what you'd expect from the tomb of a queen consort. Piers Litherland, the British archaeologist leading the excavation on behalf of the New Kingdom Research Foundation, later said that the scale of the doorway and staircase was what first made the team suspect they were dealing with something bigger than they'd assumed. Litherland has spent more than a decade working in this specific stretch of the Theban necropolis, and the discovery came after years of painstaking, unglamorous fieldwork that most people never hear about because it doesn't come with a headline. The proof came from something small and easy to overlook: broken alabaster jars. Fragments of these vessels, once used to hold oils, perfumes, or ritual substances, were inscribed with hieroglyphic text naming Thutmos II directly as the deceased king. Other fragments bore the name of his great royal wife, Hatshepsut, the woman who would go on to become one of the most powerful rulers in Egyptian history. Put together, those two names on the same set of vessels left no real ambiguity. This wasn't a queen's tomb. It was the burial place of a pharaoh, and the inscriptions tied it directly to Thutmos II and his queen. Dr. Mohammed Ismail Khalid, Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, called it one of the most significant archaeological finds in recent years, and it's easy to see why. This wasn't simply a new tomb. It was the very last piece of a puzzle Egyptologists had been trying to complete for over a century. Every other pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, the dynasty that includes legendary names like Hatshepsut, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun himself, had already had their burial site identified. Thutmos II was the missing name on that list, the last blank space on the map of the Valley of the Kings and its surrounding wadis. So who was this pharaoh exactly, and why did it take so long to find him? Thutmose II reigned during the 15th century BC, with most historians placing his rule somewhere between roughly 1493 and 1479 BC, though the exact dates remain debated among scholars. He was the son of Thutmose I and a secondary wife named Mutnefret, which meant his claim to the throne wasn't as clean-cut as it might have been had he been born to the principal queen. To strengthen his position and legitimize his rule, he married his own half-sister Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, through his great royal wife, Ahmose. This kind of sibling marriage among royalty wasn't shocking by ancient Egyptian standards. It was actually a fairly common strategy for keeping the bloodline and the throne within the same family, especially in a court where succession could easily be contested by half-siblings and rival branches of the same dynasty. Egypt during this period was not the same country it had been just a generation earlier. The 18th dynasty had emerged after the expulsion of the Hyksos, a foreign dynasty that had ruled parts of Egypt from the north for roughly a century. Thutmose II's father, Thutmose I, had already begun pushing Egypt's borders outward, campaigning deep into Nubia to the south and as far as the Euphrates region to the northeast, transforming Egypt from a regional kingdom into an emerging imperial power. Thutmose II inherited a throne that came with real military and administrative expectations attached to it, even if his own reign didn't produce the same scale of achievement his father's had. Compared to the pharaohs who came before and after him, Thutmose II's reign was relatively short, and by most accounts, unremarkable in terms of grand achievements. He's mostly remembered today for two things, being the father of Thutmose III, who would go on to become one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs, and for being married to Hatshepsut, who, after his death, would rule as pharaoh in her own right and become one of the most successful and powerful monarchs in Egyptian history, male or female. In many ways, Thutmose II has always existed in the historical shadow of his wife and son. Almost nothing has survived describing what he actually did as king, aside from a partial account of a military campaign against Kush in Egypt's south, early in his reign. Because so little textual evidence about him exists, and because no funerary equipment bearing his name had ever previously turned up in any museum collection anywhere in the world, this discovery genuinely fills in a historical gap rather than simply confirming what was already known. One of the few surviving records from his reign describes a military campaign into the region of Kush, in what is now northern Sudan, launched during the very first year of his rule. The inscription recounting that campaign is unusually blunt for royal Egyptian propaganda, describing an order to leave no male alive among the rebelling population. It's a harsh, uncomfortable detail, but historically valuable precisely because so little else survives to describe how this pharaoh actually governed. Beyond that campaign, records suggest his health may have been a persistent issue throughout his life, and most historians now agree that he likely died relatively young, possibly still in his 20s or early 30s, after a reign that probably lasted somewhere between 3 and 13 years, depending on which ancient king list a historian chooses to trust. Ancient Egyptian chronology from this period is notoriously difficult to pin down with precision, since different sources occasionally contradict one another on reign lengths. Inside the tomb, the archaeological team found traces of decoration that helped confirm both its royal status and its age. Fragments of blue-painted plaster, dotted with yellow stars, had fallen from what was once a painted ceiling depicting the night sky, a common motif in royal Egyptian tombs meant to represent the heavens the pharaoh's soul would travel through in the afterlife. Sections of wall decoration also preserved portions of the Amduet, a sacred funerary text also known as the Book of the Hidden Chamber, which describes the sun god Ra's nightly journey through the underworld. This text was typically reserved for royal burials, and its presence was one of the clearest indicators that whoever was buried here held the highest status in the land. The layout of the tomb itself also matched patterns seen in other early 18th dynasty royal burials, with a descending corridor that bends partway along its length rather than running in a straight line, a design choice believed to reflect the sun god's nightly path through the underworld as described in the same funerary texts painted on the walls. Restoring what remained of that decoration wasn't simple. Because of the flood damage, much of the plaster had detached from the walls and ceiling entirely, meaning conservators had to carefully recover fragments from the debris field and piece together which sections belonged where, essentially reconstructing a painted narrative from a puzzle whose box had been shaken for 35 centuries. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, and it's the part that makes this discovery genuinely strange compared to most tomb finds. When archaeologists finally cleared their way into the burial chamber, they didn't find treasure. They found almost nothing at all. No sarcophagus, no canopic jars, which the Egyptians used to preserve internal organs, no Shabti figurines, the small funerary statues meant to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. Aside from the alabaster jar fragments that identified the tomb's owner and some funerary furniture, the first ever recovered for Thutmose II anywhere, the space was essentially empty. For a royal tomb, that's about as unusual as it gets. The explanation lies in the tomb's location, and it turned out to be its fatal flaw. Building a burial chamber directly beneath a natural waterfall in the Theban mountains might have offered secrecy, but it also made the site catastrophically vulnerable to flash flooding. Evidence gathered by the excavation team suggests the tomb was inundated by floodwater within just a few years of Thutmos II's burial, likely within about 6 years. Densely packed debris, hardened over the centuries into something close to solid concrete, filled the main corridor, and the flooding caused sections of the ceiling to collapse. The tomb the team eventually walked into wasn't just empty. It was structurally compromised, its walls damaged, its decorated plaster crumbling. A burial site the Egyptians themselves likely realized had failed almost as soon as it was sealed. That raises an obvious question. If the tomb flooded and became unusable so quickly after the king's death, what happened to everything that was originally placed inside it? According to the excavation team, preliminary evidence suggests that ancient priests or officials made the decision to relocate the tomb's contents to a different, safer location, essentially performing damage control on a burial that had gone catastrophically wrong within a handful of years. This wasn't unheard of in ancient Egypt. Priests frequently moved royal mummies and grave goods centuries later, during periods of instability, to protect them from tomb robbers. What makes this case different is the timing. This wasn't a rescue operation carried out generations later. It appears to have happened almost immediately, a direct emergency response to a flood that ruined the tomb before it had even had time to become sacred ground. This is where Piers Litherland's investigation took an even more remarkable turn. While searching the surrounding area for clues about where those relocated grave goods might have ended up, his team found a posthumous inscription buried in a pit alongside evidence of a ritual cow sacrifice. According to Litherland, this inscription suggests that Hatshepsut herself, the king's widow and eventual successor, personally oversaw the relocation of her husband's burial equipment to a second, previously unknown tomb nearby. If that's accurate, it means the woman who would go on to become one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs was directly responsible for salvaging what remained of her husband's burial after the first tomb failed. Litherland believes he's identified where that second tomb might be. Roughly 23 meters, about 75 feet, of layered limestone flakes, ash, rubble, and mud plaster sit stacked on top of a specific point in the landscape near the original tomb. According to Litherland, the sheer scale and composition of this pile isn't natural. It shows signs of deliberate human construction, including discarded beer jars and worn-out chisel tips, the kind of debris typically left behind by ancient workmen. His theory is that this massive mound was built intentionally to conceal and protect a second burial chamber underneath it, essentially camouflaging a tomb as part of the mountainside itself. If he's right, an excavation of that mound is still ongoing, it could turn out to be intact, undisturbed for 35 centuries, precisely because it was hidden so effectively that even ancient tomb robbers never found it. There's an added layer of mystery here that makes the potential second tomb even more significant. For well over a century, a mummy catalogued as CG61066, discovered in the 19th century in a hidden royal cache known as Tomb TT320, had been identified as Thutmos II and is currently displayed in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo. But Litherland has publicly questioned that identification. Medical analysis of the mummy suggests the individual died at around 30 years of age, and there's reason to believe, though it isn't entirely settled among Egyptologists, that Thutmos II may not have lived quite that long. If the age doesn't match, it raises the uncomfortable possibility that the mummy long presented to museum visitors as this pharaoh may not actually be him at all, which would make locating an undisturbed second tomb, potentially containing his real remains, one of the most significant Egyptological developments in decades. To be clear about where things currently stand, this second tomb has not been confirmed. It remains a strong hypothesis backed by physical evidence and inscriptions, not a finished discovery. Excavating through that man-made mound safely is slow, careful work, and Egyptologists are, for good reason, cautious about declaring victory before the chamber itself has actually been reached and verified. Litherland himself has acknowledged that tunneling directly into the mound proved too dangerous given its unstable composition, meaning the team has instead had to dismantle sections of it by hand, layer by careful layer. That kind of caution isn't overcautious bureaucracy. It's the same discipline that allowed the team to correctly identify the first tomb in the first place, rather than announcing a discovery prematurely and getting the attribution wrong. But if Litherland's theory holds up, it would mean archaeologists are on the verge of finding something almost unheard of in modern Egyptology. A completely sealed royal tomb, one that even the ancient Egyptians' own tomb robbers and priest-led relocations of the New Kingdom era never touched. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how much detective work went into this entire discovery. This wasn't a case of archaeologists digging in an unexplored area and getting lucky. Litherland and his colleagues at the New Kingdom Research Foundation had been working this specific corner of the Theban necropolis for well over a decade, before the tomb's entrance was even found in 2022. Even after that, it took roughly 2 more years of careful excavation and analysis before the team could confidently say whose tomb they'd actually found. Identifying ancient Egyptian royalty isn't as simple as finding a name carved into a wall. Names get reused across generations. Inscriptions get damaged or partially destroyed, and context matters enormously. It was the combination of the tomb's location, its architectural scale, the funerary texts on the walls, and specifically the alabaster fragments naming both Thutmose II and Hatshepsut together, that allowed the team to confirm ownership beyond reasonable doubt. The discovery also forces a reconsideration of exactly how the Valley of the Kings and its surrounding valleys functioned as a burial complex. For a long time, the working assumption was that early 18th dynasty pharaohs were buried within a fairly tight, predictable radius close to the main valley. Thutmose II's tomb challenges that. Being found roughly 2.5 kilometers away, in a completely separate wadi associated more with royal wives than with kings, suggests that the geography of royal burial during this period was more experimental and possibly more improvised than Egyptologists previously assumed. Some researchers now believe early 18th dynasty kings may have been testing different burial locations before the Valley of the Kings became firmly established as the dynasty's primary royal necropolis later in its history. There's also something quietly poignant about this particular discovery when you consider Thutmose II's place in history. He ruled during a transitional moment, sandwiched between his more famous father, his far more famous wife, and his enormously accomplished son. Historical records from his reign are thin. He isn't credited with major military conquests on the scale of his sons, nor architectural achievements to rival his wife's spectacular mortuary temple, which still stands today just a few kilometers from where his tomb was ultimately found. For centuries, he existed almost as a footnote, a name mentioned mainly in relation to the people around him. This discovery, ironically, gives him back a piece of his own story. For the first time, physical funerary objects bearing his own name have entered the archaeological and museum record, filling a gap that had persisted since his death roughly 3,500 years ago. It's also worth putting this discovery into perspective against the broader history of Egyptology as a field. During the height of what's often called Egyptomania, when European explorers and archaeologists first began systematically excavating the region in the 19th century, new tombs and burial sites turned up at a startling pace, sometimes within the same year. As the decades passed, that pace slowed dramatically. Discoveries went from happening every few years to every few decades. By the 20th and 21st centuries, a newly identified pharaoh's tomb had become one of the rarest events in the entire field. The fact that this discovery happened in the same general region as Tutankhamun's tomb and represents the first of its kind there in over 100 years is precisely why archaeologists, historians, and the public alike reacted the way they did when it was announced. Egypt's government has also treated the discovery as more than an academic milestone. Tourism remains one of the country's most important economic sectors, and a new royal tomb, especially one connected to Hatshepsut and the golden age of the 18th dynasty, generates the kind of global attention that draws visitors back to Luxor. Officials describe the find as one of the most significant archaeological breakthroughs in recent years, and the site is expected to eventually become part of the broader network of excavations open to researchers and, in some limited capacity, the public, once conservation work is far enough along to make that safe. For now, the tomb remains an active excavation site, closed off while the team continues stabilizing its damaged structure and documenting what's left of its decoration before any of it degrades further. What makes this story worth following isn't just what's already been found, it's what might still be discovered. If Litherland's team does eventually break through into that second, still hidden chamber, and if it turns out to be sealed and undisturbed, it would represent an almost unprecedented opportunity in modern archaeology. A genuine, untouched royal burial from one of history's most studied civilizations. It could potentially resolve the mystery surrounding which mummy actually belongs to Thutmose II, provide the first complete set of funerary equipment ever recovered for this pharaoh, and offer new insight into how 18th dynasty royal burial practices actually worked in their earliest, least understood phase. Or it could turn out to be something else entirely. An empty chamber, a false lead, or evidence that the priests who once tried to save Thutmose II's legacy from a flooded tomb didn't manage to fully succeed. Either way, the excavation is ongoing, and every stage of it is being documented by a team that has already spent more than a decade earning the right to answer that question properly, rather than rushing toward a headline. This is ultimately a story about how much of ancient Egypt still remains beneath the sand, waiting to be understood rather than simply found. A tomb entrance sat exposed and accessible for over 2 years before anyone could say with confidence who it belonged to. A pile of debris sitting quietly beside it may or may not be concealing one of the most important undisturbed royal burials in Egyptological history. And a pharaoh who spent 3,500 years as a supporting character in someone else's story has, for the first time, become the center of his own. If the second tomb is eventually confirmed, this story is far from over. If you want to see where this goes next, the best thing you can do is stay close to it. If this kind of deep dive into ancient history and real archaeological mysteries is something you enjoy, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of this coming. Drop a comment and let me know what you think is waiting inside that second tomb. Hit like if you learned something new today, and I'll see you in the next one.